And it is a great pleasure to welcome our guest to the show today. Man, I've listened to many times in different shows and podcasts over the years because he is a historian of show business and particularly of comedy. And his latest book is called Outrageous, a history of showbiz and the culture wars. We're joined today by Kliph Nesteroff, who is busy on his book tour. The book just comes out today as we record this interview with Kliph. And I believe he's in New York today. And Kliph, real pleasure to talk to you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm sitting in my publisher's office, and I write from California, so I've never been in this giant New York City skyscraper. It's incredible. They're located on the 9th floor of the original AT&T building when they were still just a telegraph company. So it is incredibly ornate with these ancient elevators and statues and marble carvings, and it's very intimidating, actually. But
I grew up
happy
in New York,
to be here with you.
I've not been there in a while, but I imagine it's still, if you haven't seen it before, it must really be interesting.
I mean, it really is the height of commerce, and it makes me feel like a big shot. But then I walk in here, and there's 1,000 employees, and none of them know who I am.
That's right.
It brings me back down to earth.
Well, before we talk about the book, I have to say I've enjoyed listening to you. I know you used to go on with, unfortunately, the late Gilbert Gottfried, his great podcast, which I miss a lot, and several others. But, boy, that was a lot of fun when you were on with him.
Yeah, I miss Gilbert so much. I really only got to know him in the last 5 years of his life, did his podcast several times. I eulogized him live on CNN the next morning, which was a hard thing for me.
Okay.
I'd been on CNN. Yeah, I'd been on CNN many times, but I'd never been asked to talk about somebody so quickly, after they had died. So I was still a little bit in shock. They wanted me on live, and so they wanted me for 6 a.m., the morning show in New York, but I live in Los Angeles, so I had to go to CNN on the Sunset Strip at 2:30 in the morning. It was just me and a security guard, and I was on air at 3, and ahead of time they had asked for photos of me and Gilbert, and I said, yeah, I have those, but I'd rather not put them up on the screen because I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about him. But they were like, no, it'll establish the context of who you are. And I said, yeah, but I didn't know him that well. I knew him a little bit from the last few years of his life. They're like, well, they'll understand that. We'll say that on there. I was like, okay, I just don't want it to make it look like I'm exploiting somebody's death, name dropping, making it self-serving. So I go in there, I'm sitting in the green room at 2:30 in the morning, and they run a little teaser for my 3 a.m. spot and says, coming up next, Gilbert Gottfried's lifelong friend. Speak. I'm like, no, that's what I asked you not to do. But
what a
anyways,
surprise!
I miss Gilbert
doing
a lot.
Something not quite accurate. A big surprise.
Yeah. I guess that's how it works. But yeah, no, I miss Gilbert so much. That guy was just
He
pure
was exactly
comedy.
what you heard, right? I mean, that's the way he was off at Mike too, wasn't he?
No, actually. No, it wasn't at all, actually.
Really?
He had 3 levels to him. He had the screamiest version that when he was on a roll on stage, doing a roast where he was just shouting. Then you had the version of him you heard on the podcast where it was like a conversational version of that voice. And then the voice when you got to know him and when he would talk to you in person or phone you, this is how you knew he trusted you or that he liked you. He would call and say, hey, Kliph, it's Gilbert. I had a question for you. And that was his real voice. Okay. So he had 3 levels of the voice. It wasn't that he was really doing a fake voice when he did the podcast. He was so used to doing that affected cadence that it flowed naturally. But with his family and with people he trusted, you didn't hear any of that gravelly voice at all.
I happened to see the documentary maybe 3 or 4 months ago about him. Unfortunately, he'd already passed, but I mean, I'd heard it came out. I didn't get to see it when it came out, but very interesting guy. Yeah, interesting. And his wife, God bless his wife.
Miss him. Yeah, she's amazing. Dara's great. Absolutely. Yeah. And his kids are adorable as well.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that kind of ties into the book a little bit because he was definitely an outrageous comedian, and he had his share of kind of being written off, right? Going back to the even the roast, 2001 roast, where he told the famous aristocrats joke, and then, of course, later on with the Aflac situation. That kind of ties into the book's topic, doesn't it?
Yes, and in fact, Gilbert is in the book. I wanted to give a couple examples from his career that predated the Aflac duck controversy, because people often point to it as, a product of our modern times and how people react on social media. But Gilbert got into a hot water long before that. There's two instances, one that's in the book and one that isn't. One that isn't in the book, it was, but it got cut out. He was appearing on the Howard Stern show, as he often did. He
Right.
was a regular on that program for years and years and years. In the late 80s, I don't even know how many people remember this, but the Howard Stern show, for all its salaciousness, was a commercial program. They would have commercials, and they would have music. They would just play regular records, and Robin Givens would give the news at the top of the hour. And when Gilbert was the guest, they'd make him sit in on the weather reports and the news, and he would interrupt and make crude remarks that were hilarious. And at one point, Robin Givens was giving a news report in the late 1980s and referred to a child that had gone missing, and Gilbert made some sort of incredibly tasteless, hilarious comment. And the Howard Stern show, which was known for salaciousness and outrageousness, lost sponsors because of Gilbert's joke. I think the sponsor was Miracle Whip. They dropped their sponsorship because of the comment that Gilbert made during the news. And then a couple years later, this story is in the book. He was a presenter on the Emmy Awards. It was 1991, and it was on the Fox network. And the Fox network was already known for being a little bit racier than the typical networks, with shows like Married with Children and The Simpsons. And Gilbert went up there to present the Emmy for Best Writing in a Variety or Comedy Series. And so he was reading the names of the writers of, like Saturday Night Live was nominated that year. And interesting, when you watch the clip, some of the names that he mentioned weren't famous then. They're very famous now. Among the SNL writers that were nominated, who Gilbert read their names off the teleprompter, included Bob Odenkirk and Conan O'Brien. But anyways, he goes out there, and he was supposed to read off the teleprompter whatever jokes had been written for him, and he completely abandoned the plan. That same week, earlier that week, Pee Wee Herman, Paul Reubens, had famously been busted in an adult movie theater for lewd behavior. And Gilbert carried into a series of jokes about that scandal. And he started off going, "I'm so glad Pee Wee Herman is finally off the streets. I feel so much safer. If masturbation is a crime, then I am Al Capone." So he goes on this rant of jokes related to the Pee Wee Herman masturbation scandal, and it kills. The audience is howling. But in the control room, they were going crazy because this was off script. So the director was mad, the head writer was mad, the producers were mad. And much of middle America thought it was in extremely bad taste. They're watching this show with their kids, and there's Gilbert talking about masturbation. It created all of this controversy for at least a week. The Fox network said Gilbert Gottfried will never be on this network again. The producers said Gilbert Gottfried will never be on the Emmy Award show again. Michael Medved, a film critic turned sort of evangelical advocate who became Rush. Yeah, he became Rush Limbaugh's guest host later. He said that Gilbert Gottfried's performance was indicative of Hollywood's addiction to bad taste and contempt for the rest of America. He essentially blamed Gilbert for the downfall of morality. So this was almost 15 years before Aflac Duck.
Right.
And so that's sort of the crux of this book, to demonstrate that all the things that we think are new when it comes to controversy in comedy, with people being criticized for things they do or say, for people getting in trouble for jokes, that is not a new phenomenon. That is not a product of uptight college students or millennials or even social media or evil liberals. It is consistent with the cycles that we have lived through again and again and again throughout showbiz history and throughout American history.
Yeah, and again, reading the book, I've like you, although not to the extent you are, because you really dig deep into the history of show business. I've always kind of been interested in it, but you go back to the turn of the century, where even in vaudeville days. And then you talk about Bob Hope was kind of controversial at one time on radio. I mean, that's hard to believe.
Well, in the late 30s, when Bob Hope was on radio, that's when he was first starting to make comments about the Democrats and the Republicans. Yeah. And the jokes, honestly, were interchangeable. They were not specific. So if he made a crack about the Democrats that got a laugh, he could switch the word to Republican and it would get the same laugh. Right. They were sort of generic. He wasn't targeting people's policies. He wasn't personal about it like it is today in political comedy. It was very generic. He would make jokes about the president's golf game. But political commentary and certainly political comedy was largely taboo in those days, especially on network radio and TV, where sponsors were fitting the bill and did not want to alienate potential consumers. And so there were internal memos at NBC saying, we're getting complaints, can you tell Bob Hope to stop talking about politics?
Yeah, it's hard to believe that, you listen to some of those radio shows, they were great, and he was probably the first guy, I guess he and Milton Berle, to kind of develop that quick one-liner, fast-paced style of stand-up comedy, right? I mean, those are the two guys that you'd say were pioneering in that style, but also topical.
They were definitely progenitors of the sort of stereotype of the stand-up comic, of the fast-talking guy, the wise-cracking guy. There were other dudes before them in vaudeville, but because they weren't on radio, they didn't gain the same national recognition. So Berle and Hope did, so they get the credit. Vaudeville, at its height, if you were a star, at the most, 4,000 people would hear you at the same time. With radio, it was millions of people that would hear you at the same time. So it had a greater structure. This also led to instances of joke thieving and thievery, because if somebody did a joke on stage and only 100 people heard it and the guy wasn't on radio and a radio comedian stole it and did it on radio, suddenly that joke would be identified with the radio comedian, and the next person that person tried to do it on stage, the person who had been stolen from, he would be the one accused of stealing. They'd be like, oh, you stole that from the radio, instead of it was the other way around.
And then kind of moving into the 50s, and again, your book kind of goes back even further than we just talked about, but with this, outrageous, of course, the history of showbiz and the culture wars, people being outraged at what's being said on stage or early radio, television. But I guess the 50s, where comedy is concerned, at least stand-up comedy, Lenny Bruce, he's kind of the turning point, right, of what we see as comedy is today.
Oh, very definitely. Lenny Bruce, even to listen to him, is very interesting. A lot of people listen to Lenny Bruce today. It doesn't necessarily make them laugh, but maybe you're listening to the wrong, paying attention to the wrong details, because most comedy is not necessarily going to make you laugh out loud as the decades pass by. It tends to lose its bite. But the thing that's so interesting about Lenny Bruce when you listen to his stand-up is how conversational he is. Right. Before him, guys were basically reciting jokes that they had memorized. But with Lenny Bruce, he had this very casual vibe, this very casual style. He would think on stage. He didn't mind leaving a little bit of space there. His mind would wander, and he would meander a bit. Now, at the time, that was seen as unprofessional. But if you were to go to the Comedy Store in Los Angeles today or the Comedy Cellar in New York today, that's how most comedians function. Most stand-up comics are extremely conversational. Now, that is neither for better or for worse. That's just what the style is. A person comes on stage and goes, how you guys doing tonight? Oh, that's a weird sweater. They start talking to the crowd. Or they take pauses and they go, oh, what else is going on? And there's a rawness there that did not exist in stand-up comedy until Lenny Bruce came along. So he definitely helped transform the art form from a very by rote format, in which comedians, my late friend Jack Carter, who was of the old school,
I love Jack Carter.
He described them. Yeah, he described the comedians of his generation, including himself, as reciters. They just recited things that they committed to memory. Lenny Bruce was not a reciter. He was a new wave. He was the opposite. He was more of a thinker. on the stage, and it was less contrived. And that is how stand-up comedy has essentially been ever since.
Yeah, I got to see, speaking of Jack Carter, it was a great night of comedy. I was living on Long Island, that's where I grew up, at a great theater there called the Westbury Music Fair, and it had a night of comedy. Jack Carter, Freddie Roman, Dick Shawn, Joey Adams, and Gene Bayless, real old school comics. And it was one of the funniest nights I've ever seen anywhere, but old school. It was great.
Okay, I got to tell you a story about Jack Carter and Joey Adams. I don't think you can use this on local radio,
okay,
but
well,
I hope maybe you
well,
can.
So we'll edit as needed.
You can include it on the pod. You can hopefully include it on the podcast. But so at the Friars Club in New York and in Los Angeles, they would have portraits commissioned of all the great comedians that were members of the Friars, and they had professional oil painters do these beautiful portraits of the comedians posing, and they were very pretentious looking paintings, Jack Carter with a cape strung over one shoulder, smiling, painting of Alan King, a painting of Eddie Cantor, a painting of Al Jolson, a painting of Milton Berle, all the greats of show business who belonged to the Friars Club. Joey Adams was always considered sort of a poor man's comic. He was never one of the greats. He was never one of the great Las Vegas headliners. He was never one of the great Ed Sullivan stars. He was always
pretty
around.
Much a columnist. He wrote a joke column in the New York Post. Yeah.
Right, and he wrote books. So he had other channels of communication, but nobody considered him one of the great comedians, certainly not at the level of a Milton Berle or an Alan King. He knew that. All the comedians knew it, but Joey Adams ate at the Friars Club every day, and they never commissioned a portrait of him. So Joey Adams went out and had a oil painting portrait done of him out of his own pocket. He paid for it. He got this artist to do this really elaborate Joey Adams painting. He brought it to the Friars Club, hung it up himself, and then would sit at that table beneath his painting every afternoon and eat soup. Jack Carter saw that, and he comes into the Friars Club and he goes, "Joey, I want to let you know. Okay, you can sit here beneath that painting, but the day you die, that painting comes right down."
I can imagine he would say that.
Yeah.
Joey Adams really, like you said, he wrote the books. He did a joke column in the New York Post, and I guess he did a little TV in the '50s. But he was not in that league, obviously, of those other guys. But he was.
Well,
on
eventually he was
in
in
New York. He was one of those guys.
WOR.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, he was kind of later on in the shadow of his wife, Cindy Adams, who was a very well-known columnist. Yeah, and she was also Donald Trump's original booster.
That's
she kind of helped make him famous in New York by writing many columns about him back in the late 70s.
I believe, originally, in her column. The Donald.
Wow. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, we'll move up to the more present time, and we'll run out of time. We're talking with Kliph Nesteroff, and Outrageous, A History of Showbiz and the Culture Wars is the name of the book. Great kind of historical look back at great comedy, but also what was considered, as the title says, outrageous or controversial, or maybe even politically incorrect. That term wasn't used back then. But you mentioned Howard Stern, and I tend to agree with you, Kliph. I think the show that he did was 10 times better, or even more, when he was on regular radio than since he moved over to satellite. I think he lost a lot when he went to satellite. Now it's just unlistenable, at least in my opinion. But I don't know what
Yeah, isn't that ironic? Well, I don't make that argument in the book that the one was worse than the other. I think you're right in the sense the show then was more entertaining. It was more entertaining for me, though, not necessarily because of the salaciousness, but because of the comedians they'd have on. They would have somebody like Joey Adams on. Stuttering John would attack Joey Adams, in the street, and then they would play it on the air, and it was hilarious. And they don't do that anymore. Now they have huge stars. Now, if they have a comedian on, it's going to be the biggest comedian. They don't have those low-rent comedians on. They don't have elderly people from his childhood, the Soupy Saleses or the Milton Berles. Now it's big stars and even big politicians like Hillary Clinton, and it's about promoting a movie. And That isn't that ironic though that on satellite radio Howard Stern has the freedom now to say whatever he wants and he doesn't. And in those days, under the jurisdiction of the FCC, he wasn't allowed to say anything, but he said them anyways.
Well, that's
So
it.
there is an irony there, and I agree with you that the show probably, well, not probably, it isn't as entertaining as it was back then. Although even for somebody like me, they did things that I found sometimes unnecessarily crass. He could be very cruel to people like Milton Berle and many people in their twilight years. He really bullied, and it was funny. But then a lot of these people also died, and it kind of is heartbreaking to listen to some of that now because, you know, I did feel bad when he would bully certain old comedians.
Yeah. Yeah, another comedian, and you talk about it in the book, a guy that you would think, you know, traditional, old school type of comedian, of course, basically invented the Tonight Show, talking about Steve Allen. But back in the 50s, I didn't realize this till I read your book, and then maybe some of his earlier books, you know, you read a little bit about him. He was kind of controversial, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, for a number of reasons. You know, Steve Allen was a hip guy in the 50s. He was very interested in jazz music and jazz culture, and he liked to parody beatnik slang. And for that reason, those interests, he often booked a lot of black musicians, which was frowned upon by certain sponsors. They didn't want to upset the Deep South. And on one episode, he kissed Lena Horne on the cheek, which was considered a no-no to be a white person on TV, familiar, as the phrase went, with a black performer. And he got all kinds of racist hate mail as a result. And then later, in the late 1950s, when he had the Sunday night Steve Allen show, he started to mention political causes on the air. He was an advocate of an organization called SANE, for a sane nuclear policy, which was advocating for nuclear disarmament. And the John Birch Society thought that this was essentially giving the communists what they wanted. They considered Steve Allen a dupe of Soviet propaganda, and they heavily criticized him. And Steve Allen received a flurry of death threats in the late 50s and early 1960s, literally being told that somebody was going to come to his office in Sherman Oaks and blow his head off unless he stopped talking about SANE and advocating for nuclear disarmament. And in fact, the FBI got involved to investigate who was sending all these death threats to Steve Allen. And you can find them on the internet. The FBI has an archive, and you can find it on archive.org. Go through Steve Allen's FBI file and read these horrifying, vulgar, vitriolic hate letters and death threats that were sent to Steve Allen, who was only trying to make people laugh.
Yeah. And he also wrote a book, I think it was his final book before he passed, about the terrible things that are going on in the media, right?
Well, as Steve Allen grew older, he, like so many people, became more conservative.
Yeah.
And so the organizations that went after him in the 50s and the early 60s were considered far right. The John Birch Society, not even conservative. They did call themselves conservative, but they had some very
they were
aggressive and sometimes violent tactics. But Steve Allen, like many people, grew more conservative as he got older, and I demonstrate that throughout the book. There's many arcs like that. Mae West goes from being considered salacious and too sexual and immoral in the 30s, and by the 70s, she's saying that Hollywood is too sexual and salacious and immoral, so she also turned conservative. Steve Allen's last book, it's very interesting to read just for historical purposes. I'm not sure that there'll be much in it that you'll agree with, but it's so interesting to see his point of view. It was called Vulgarians at the Gate, and it was about
Vulgarians, right?
Yeah, and it was all about how he felt Hollywood was addicted, like Michael Medved said, to blue humor and to crassness and to vulgarity, and he criticized Howard Stern as the worst offender. But the weird thing is, he didn't point to the most outrageous things that Howard Stern said. He criticized the movie that was made, I guess, in 1995 based on the book Private Parts.
Yeah.
And the thing that disgusted Steve Allen was the title. he hated the title Private Parts.
Right.
He didn't think there should be a movie called that. And he wrote an angry letter to the tabloid gossip show Extra because they did a segment on the show and they kept repeating the title Private Parts, Private Parts. And Steve Allen wrote this angry letter. This is disgusting. How can you keep repeating the words Private Parts? It's so innocent by today's standards. But Steve Allen was upset with that. He was upset with the Farrelly brothers because of the famous scene in There's Something About Mary.
Oh, right.
And he was upset with the sitcom that David Spade was in called Just Shoot Me. All of these things seem so innocuous by today's standards, but they really upset Steve Allen, who I love and is a hero of mine. But he passed away, actually, after he finished writing that book, but before it came out. So Jane Meadows ended up doing the book tour for Vulgarians at the Gate because Steve Allen passed away.
Yeah, I had a chance to talk to her. She was very nice. I would have loved to talk to Steve. I used to listen to him. One of his last shows he did was a radio show in New York on WNEW, and then it went national for a while.
Right.
Radio show was fun to listen
Right.
to.
You can hear there are some outtakes of that show floating around YouTube from some network feed.
Yeah, the last week, I believe.
And you can hear him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an episode where the guest is Jim Backus, Mr. Howells
really?
from Gilligan's Island. And it's Steve Allen and Jim Backus doing these segments together. But because whoever uploaded it had access to the network feed, you can hear them talking amongst each other during the commercial breaks.
Really? Oh, I got to try.
And boy, is that ever interesting.
Yeah,
it's just really interesting because Steve Allen's sort of tinkering on a piano, and Jim Backus tones it way down. He's in a more of a conversational voice instead of a loud Mr. Magoo voice that he would affect, But it's fascinating to listen to that stuff, and I love Steve Allen, and sometimes I fear that with this book, in addressing his turn against business in the late 90s, that it's going to come across sounding too critical. It's not meant to sound critical. It's just statement of fact. I love Steve Allen.
Yeah, no question. Well, Kliph Nesteroff, I could talk for hours on this. I enjoy talking about old-time showbiz myself. My uncle was in show business, so I had a little bit of a taste of it as a kid. He belonged to a club called the Lambs Club, or he actually was the shepherd of that, which was kind of like the Friars Club. So
really?
I always got to
Who
see
was your
some of
uncle?
those. What's that? His name was Tom Dillon. He was a singer.
Oh, Tom Dillon.
I thought you of the variety shows in the 50s, but he basically and he worked for the Actors Fund for years. Actors Fund Home in New Jersey.
Oh, how interesting!
Yeah, interesting man. But anyway,
cool.
We'll let you go. I know you're on the book tour. I saw some great articles already today as we record this about the book. So congratulations on it. Outrageous: A History of Showbiz on the Culture Wars, and I guess anywhere you can get it, right? All the places, all the bookstores, and online, right?
Yes, it's available everywhere. Thank you so much.
And your website, do you have a website you want to give out, or?
No.
Okay. You're one of the few people who doesn't have a website plugging a book.
Yeah. No, I mean, you can follow me on Twitter, but I'm really encouraging people to unfollow me and everybody from social media. Read the book, Outrageous. It's also available on Audible as an audiobook. I'd rather people follow me on paper with the book than on the internet. Let's all get off the internet. Let's all stop fighting with each other. Let's stop complaining about everything. Let's enjoy comedy. Let's enjoy movies. Let's enjoy books. And let's all get along.
And before we wrap up, I have to say I've been reading your old Showbiz Blogspot interviews. Those are great.
Oh, yeah.
More of those? You got to put up more.
Well,
you have them.
I'll tell you, this is what I want to do. Because Blogspot, I have a friend who's 19 years old, and boy, does she make me feel old. She refers to things like Blogspot as old internet.
That's right.
I'm like, oh. But it is the old internet, and it looks old. So what I want to do is I want to take all of those interviews that I have on Blogspot, long, in-depth interviews that I did with people like Shecky Greene and Jack Carter and Will Jordan and Marty Allen and Steve Rossi. Everybody has passed away with the exception of Shecky Greene, who's approaching 99 years old.
Wow.
I want to publish those in a book. Judd Apatow had great success with his two books, Sick in the Head and Sicker in the Head, and they're just transcriptions of interviews with people in the comedy field. So I would like to do a version of that for the old-time comedians who have passed on. All those interviews are available to read on the Blogspot, classicshowbiz.blogspot.com, but I want to put them down on paper and get those out as a big, thick, fat book.
Yeah, no doubt. And when you do, your publicist will let me know via email, but I'd love to talk to you at that time. That'd be great. But in the meantime, I want to get outrageous.
Of course.
Kliph Nesteroff, real pleasure talking to you. I know we kept you longer, but good luck on the rest of the book tour, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Doug.